critical race theory. Now, this is probably one of the most divisive and controversial topics around, and I personally think that's just because it's so widely misunderstood. So let's try to unpack it. What is critical race theory? Well, it's based on the idea that racism is systemic and entrenched into particularly American institutions. And it's something that has been debated and taught in American law schools for decades. It's nothing new. But it found itself being one of the most widely discussed topics in the country after the killing of George Floyd in 2020. To put it simply, it's the objective analysis of history, looking at how it impacts our present. And the idea that racism is systemic basically means that it has either been consciously or unconsciously built into the systems that govern our everyday lives. So let's make it very clear now. Critical race theory is not about being critical of white people. It's about making a critical analysis of these oppressive and unequal systems. So essentially, it looks to address how black people are prejudiced when it comes to things like treatment by police and the disproportionate numbers that are caught up in the legal system, or access to employment or access to education. It basically asks where these prejudices stem from. And if we look at the history of America, then there are some pretty undeniable truths. Slavery happened. Segregation, or apartheid, whatever you want to call it, happened. Black people being killed by police still happening, as we know all too well. And all of these things create aftershocks which persist for generations. So why is there so much resistance to critical race theory? Those who oppose critical race theory label it anti-American, and that it brands all white people as racist, which therefore makes it racist in and of itself. Now, don't get me wrong, if that were an accurate description of critical race theory, then yeah, it would be pretty messed up. But that's not what it is, at least to my understanding. I think fear plays a central role in this opposition. There's long been a deep frustration in the black community. And yes, as with all marginalised groups, radical groups will inevitably form whose views don't represent the wider community. The problem I think we have here is a misunderstanding that critical race theory only serves to promote some dangerous radical ideology, when in actual fact it just calls for a more accurate telling of history and social studies. What should children be taught? Well, for me, if we are teaching history and social studies, then first and foremost, it must be accurate, unbiased, and all-encompassing. Right now, let's be honest, most of the history that we learn about in school is very selective. We know with things like Black History Month that there's only a certain amount of black history that seems to have been deemed palatable, and yet there's such a rich and empowering history which needs to be explored. And of course, that is the point of this channel, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. And surely a state education system, I personally believe all education systems, but surely a state education system should be representative of the children they are educating. As I said, there's no place for bias in the education system, especially when we're talking about factual events in history and the statistical correlations that can be drawn from that in terms of the systems which ultimately predate all of us. So moving on to those systems and institutions then. We live under them. They influence our individual lives, every single one of us. And there are certain trends which are evident and undeniable. According to Sentencing Project, African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they're more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they're more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. African American adults are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. This notion that we're suddenly going to be teaching kids that all white people are the enemy, again, is very misguided. I could imagine someone hearing those statistics that I just read out, and it's serving to function as some sort of confirmation bias. Unconscious biases exist everywhere, and having been fed a lifetime of news stories designed to provoke fear and hostility towards black people as being dangerous criminals, well, here are the statistics which reinforce that. But why not take a look at where those unconscious biases come from in the first place, which again is what critical race theory looks at. I mentioned news stories just then, and most of it unsurprisingly comes through the media, most likely to drum up political support. And I actually made a video where I talk about Stuart Hall's representation theory. It's all about how the media use their influence to deliver very deliberate and negative messages when it comes to their portrayal of black people. It's a really interesting theory, and you should definitely go and check out the video. So again, it's not about pointing fingers and saying you're racist because of this. I think that's a very destructive attitude to take. I see critical race theory as being much more of a constructive thing because it's directly addressing the root causes in an attempt to change things. Another statistic from Sentencing Project shows that as of 2001, one of every 3 black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as could one of every 6 Latinos, compared to one of every 17 white boys. Now, there's obviously no inherent differences between these kids, and yet the systems and institutions will treat them differently. And these systems ultimately affect us all as individuals on a day-to-day basis, throughout our lives. They are what govern us and to some extent shape us. So surely it's worth taking at least a critical look at them and ultimately trying to restructure them to represent a more fair and balanced society. Now, I want to make it clear that as with all education, it should be age appropriate. You wouldn't teach a 10-year-old the same things you teach a 16-year-old. And as Kimberly Crenshaw, the woman who coined the term critical race theory, as she said herself, this is traditionally a course at law school, taking a deep dive into how the law affects groups differently. But if it's done in the right way, I really can't see the harm in a generation of kids who, by the time they are adults, are so well educated on the ins and outs of the system that they feel able to challenge it and to affect change. Now for me, as I said earlier in the video, certain conclusions about critical race theory stem from a deep sense of fear and ignorance. I can sit here and say that of course children should be taught about the inequalities of society. After all, black parents have to reinforce that message to their kids constantly. So surely if white kids were aware of the same thing, we'd have a better chance of creating a more equal society. Well, what I think is going on is a sense of willful ignorance, that racism just isn't a problem in society. These inequalities that I'm talking about don't exist, and that there's no such thing as white privilege. So in teaching something to their children that they believe to be untrue would ultimately constitute a form of brainwashing, when if we're being real about it, the brainwashing is already in place, it's everywhere, and it has been for centuries. All we want to do is undo it. I heard a quote once, and I really wish I could remember who said it, but basically, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And the amount of people who got triggered so irrationally by critical race theory, I think that's what it ultimately comes down to, really. Anyway, that was my take on critical race theory. I'd love to get a conversation going in the comments whether you agree or disagree with what I had to say. Like I said, it's a very triggering, divisive and controversial topic, so please do try to be respectful. Don't forget to drop a like on the video and hit subscribe for more content coming soon.